But I do have good news in relation to this whole COVID-19 mess. Apparently Chuck Norris has contracted COVID-19 and the virus is now in quarantine for 2 weeks. Oh man, it's a good joke. I love it. Sorry, I had to indulge myself there. All right, let's get stuck in. In this video, I'll be comparing the XT4 to both the XT2 and the XT3 in relation to image quality and ISO performance. Now, there should be a difference between the XT2 and the XT4. You know, there's a fair amount of time between those two cameras. They don't share in the same processor and sensor, whereas the XT3 does share in the same processor and sensor as the XT4. So what would be the reason to upgrade? And I think this is a question a lot of people are asking. Are you getting into Fujifilm for the first time? Are you moving from XT2 to XT4 because you generally wait 2 generations to make the jump? Because maybe your camera now is long in the tooth, or you're an XT3 shooter and you want to avail of some of the new features that the camera offers. In the test that I did, I used the same subject. I pushed all 3 cameras in a similar way, but you will see a slight difference in the framing on the XT4 because the XT4's tripod mount is set back a little bit, fractionally. Obviously, I wanted to keep the tripod in the same place, but because of that, the XT4 sits back a little bit, which will change the framing ever so slightly. So please note that that's nothing to do with the sensor in relation to the lens. That's just purely because of the positioning of the tripod mount. First up, I'd just love to bring to your attention a business that I've been involved with over the last couple of weeks. It's not Squarespace, you can relax. This gentleman's name is Cornet. He runs a business called Never for Fame. I'll leave all the details below. He made up my new branding, my new logo work, my new graphic design work. It's work that I paid for, so this is not me doing something for free, mentioning his name. He has an incredible work ethic, was such a pleasure to work with. Did exactly what I asked of him, advised where he felt necessary, and I took his advice and was very good advice. And I'm just really happy with what he produced at what I think is a very reasonable rate. So if any of you are interested in making new logos or having any work done in regards to illustration, graphic design work, do check him out. Even if you're abroad, it's so easy to deal with him. And with the exchange rate, with the South African rand to the dollar, even euro, it's a no-brainer, especially with the good rates that he charges. So first up, before we get stuck into this comparison, I've got to say that ISO is a very complex topic. All right, so in this scenario, I've shot these scenes as I see it with my naked eye. So I think it's correctly exposed to what it actually looked like through my eye. I'm not boosting it. So it's not more underexposed in real life and I'm now boosting it with my eyes. So I'm shooting it as what I see the exposure should be. And the reason why I mention this is that, in my career as a professional, ISO behaves differently in different lighting situations. I don't know all the technical details behind it. I know a fair amount, but let's just take 2 scenarios. Let's just say you have a well-lit environment or relatively well-lit environment and you're looking for incredibly fast shutter speeds. So you're having to push your ISO to maintain a shutter speed, but you've got good light. Let's take a second scenario. Here you have a scene that's in very low light and you're trying to make it look brighter than it actually is. So you're really boosting the exposure or the scene. Now, they may be shot at the exact same ISO, but they don't have the same effect, or at least the noise performance or what you're seeing or perceiving as noise in the image differs. Bearing in mind, I've kept a constant f8. I've just changed the ISO as I've gone through it. I haven't done third stop increments. I've only done the full stop increments, so 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and 12,800. I think I've added into this as well. And as the evening got darker, because I did this at the end of the day, I didn't want to do it too late and I didn't want to do it too early. I wanted to get put it in a situation where I didn't have ridiculously long exposures to maintain an f8 at sort of 200 ISO. So you'll see that there's a change in the shutter speed. That's because when I moved on to the next camera, there was a variation in light or a slight light change by like a third or more. And I just changed it, but I didn't change it by aperture because that would have affected image quality. I changed it by shutter speed. So you'll see a slight variation in the shutter speeds. It's just me maintaining the same exposure. Also, I will confirm that Fujifilm across each camera is accurate in its exposure, because with recommended exposure index, you're not going to get the exact same per camera. So if you set up an exposure, it's not going to be bang on with every single camera brand out there. It's going to be slightly off, and there's a variation in which cameras can actually operate. But what I can confirm is that the Fujifilm cameras are very consistent across their generations of cameras. As I set all cameras the same in white balance, manually set them all, and I can confirm that across the board for XT2, XT3, and XT4, have all maintained what I call very close to or very accurate white balance across. Is it exactly the same? It would be hard to tell, but it looks pretty accurate all the way across each camera. Two things really surprised me when I started this. I've already imported the images in. I did it before I started recording. I've labeled them all. So like, for example, I put a color on each ISO rating. So they all stay together in groups and I can easily go through them. But immediately when I brought them in and I did the pick, I noticed that when I zoomed in on the XT4 image, it didn't look great. It didn't look as sharp as the other two images. Looked worse, obviously, the more I zoomed in on it. And I suddenly realized oh, there's something wrong with this camera, or this camera's image performance is not as good as its predecessor, the XT3 or even the XT2. So I gave it some thought and I was thinking, well, maybe it's the IBIS, because I'm shooting at relatively low shutter speeds. This is the IBIS kicking in at a high degree and it's affecting image quality. And I thought, no, maybe it shouldn't be that. And then I thought, well, maybe because they've given me a pre-production model, the image quality is not where it should be. So a lot of things were going through my mind. But then I systematically kind of worked through it. I looked at the way Lightroom imports the images. Now what Lightroom does is that it generally on a raw image zeroes everything off. So even if you shot 2 stops over according to your exposure in camera, when it comes into Lightroom it zeroes it out as if that is the correct exposure and you adjust from there. So that's one element. So we know that's zeroed out, but there's a couple of things that aren't zeroed out. So white balance, what you shot in camera will be represented by the correct numbers in Lightroom. So it maintains that. So whatever information in the metadata is passed on to Lightroom with the raw image, white balance is what you shot it in camera. It's not just the generic white balance. So that's one thing. So then I thought, oh, sharpening. So I went and looked at sharpening, and Lightroom automatically sharpens all raw images coming in. So it gives it a number of sharpening 40. Well, that's what it shows me here. I don't know exactly what that means in relation to its full scope of sharpening, how much it's actually adding. But what I did quickly is I took all the images and I removed all sharpening off all of them. And then all of a sudden it made sense. The XT4 was looking more comparable to the other images and it made more sense. So what I've learned from this experiment so far is that the XT4 file does not respond to Lightroom in the same way the other two files do. And it's weird because the XT3 has the same processor and image sensor as the XT4. The way sharpening looks on them is different. So when I raised the sharpening from 40 to 50 on the XT4 file, then they started looking the same when the XT3 was on 40 and the XT4 was on 50 sharpening, or the setting 50. So what I can say just from the current firmware in the camera and the current Lightroom software that's available, you're going to have to sharpen your XT4 file just fractionally more to get it to look the way you would have made your XT3 file look or your XT2 file look. So just bear that in mind and maybe just something to note. So what I did was, to make this fair, I didn't apply any sharpening. I took all sharpening off all images because I don't even want to guesstimate what the XT4 should be because it's going to affect the test. All right, so just bear that in mind. I've zeroed out everything. So let's go to compare. All right, so at the moment I have the XT2 on the left and the XT3 on the right hand side. From this distance, there's not much between these two images at all. Very, very close. It would be hard pressed if I had to not show them together for you to guess which one's which. I would say that the XT2 is pink in the box and its red is definitely more vibrant, more intense colors in the XT2. Very interesting. So but the yellow is kind of similar. Let's go in a little bit closer and let's have a look. Okay. Image quality wise, they're very similar. Both look great. Sharpness around the wheels is the same. Again, there's that blue color. The color is different. You see the blue and the silver of the body of the car. I think the XT3 is a little bit more natural silver and more like what the actual car looks like. The XT2 is a little bit bluer. Now, again, I don't know if that's the white balance difference, but I don't think so. I think it's more intense in its colors, so it's sort of more vibrant out of the camera than the others, where I think the XT3 is a more natural rendition of the red, for example. So if you look at the car itself, there's more pinks and purples in the red of the XT2 than there is in the XT3. The XT3 is far more natural. And I think the yellows are quite close. Again, the matchbox writing on the box is more natural in the XT3 than it is on the XT2. Sharpness perspective, there's very little between them. I can't really tell a difference between these two. So let's just move on. Let me go back out again so you can see that. All right, so now I'm going to choose the Okay, so now we're looking at the XT2 on the left and the XT4 on the right. Okay, so looking at this distance, even more noticeable. Now, I think this is where the XT4 has the biggest difference between both cameras, actually. And it was quite surprising because Fujifilm is well known for its color science, its colors. And like, for example, when I shot Canon, most of my time was all about removing reds out of faces, skin tones. I really battled with those kind of things. And then I had to spend a lot of time also pulling in skies, making them bluer, greens greener, where the Fujifilm is almost the opposite. Its skin tones are way more natural, but the blues can be oversaturated sometimes, and so is the green. So you've got to sort of like balance that too. But I found it easier to maintain, or at least edit, a Fuji file than it was to edit the Canon file. That's when I was shooting on Canon. You'll immediately see that the pink on the box is way, way different. Way different. The intensity of that pink in that box on the XT2 is far more vibrant, where the XT4 is so much more natural to actually how I shot it and what the box looks like in real life. The red, look at the red on the car. I'd say this is even more than the XT3, but we'll get to the XT3 comparison now. The red in the box, the sharpening is about the same. There's no real major difference there between the sharpening. The red on the matchbox writing is more realistic and red, where there's a pinky purple color coming into the XT2's red on the matchbox section. Look at the red on the fender of the car. XT4 is way more natural. There's definitely, you can see here in the shadow areas and the highlight areas, a bit of a purpley color coming through. So there's far more vibrance in the XT2 file. And the yellow, funny enough, the yellow though is more rich or more vibrant on the XT4 file. So the yellows are more there, it's sort of more vibrant. Where I'd say the XT2 was probably a bit more natural to the box for its yellow. So clearly there's no consistency between XT range or series of cameras as they move forward when it comes to color, because I've seen a difference straight away. All right, so let's go have a look here. So from far away, very little in between them from a sharpness point of view, but the colors is clear as day. The blue that sits inside the XT3's silver areas, just like the XT2, but not as bad as the XT2. I wouldn't say bad, that's probably the wrong word. Not as intensive. There's still more blue in that image. Now, I don't know if this is just the way it handles white balance, but I think it's more than just white balance, because these white balances have been set the same. There's it's pretty clear that there's more blue in that image. Okay, so looking at the purples and the pinks, again, more intensity, sort of pinky purple on the XT3, far more natural looking on the XT4. Yellow is more intense on the XT4. And just from a sharpening perspective, I think we're pretty much looking at the same. If you're looking at the writing under the car, very little. I think the whites look, the white areas in the box, which they weren't 100% white, because it's an old box, look a bit warmer. The image itself looks a bit warmer. So again, I don't know if it's just a white balance difference between the cameras or if there's actually a difference in their color science. Sharpness is not much between them. I wouldn't be able to tell from here if there's a difference. Might be a difference in the shadow and highlights. Look at that highlight on the wheel there. That looks a little bit more blown out than that one there. Little highlight pointers look a little bit more controlled in the XT4 image, but I can't tell for sure. It's not obvious. Look at the difference in those pinks. Here it looks a bit more, this looks more natural here in this area. Look at the little hair on the top. Yeah, there's a difference. It's unbelievable, being the same process and sensor, they are different. They're not the same. Okay, all right, so let's move on. We're now dealing with the 400 ISO. Okay, left image XT2, right image XT3. Sharpening, again, pretty much the same. There's very little difference from a sharpening perspective. Zoom out a little bit. Yeah, I would say there's very little difference between those two. It'd be hard to tell the difference with the naked eye. Again, more blues, slightly more blues in the XT2 than the XT3. Especially the writing underneath here, underneath the car. I noticed the white balance on the XT2, or not white balance, the way it renders colors, particularly the white areas, is different on the XT2 and the XT3 than it is to the XT4. XT4 is the most different. I still think though that the reds have improved on the XT3, so I think that the XT2's vibrance in the reds was a little bit too much, where this is more vibrant than the XT4, but closer to being more natural to what it actually is. You can see the difference between these two reds. It's quite obvious. Sharpness is pretty much the same. Little hairs on the roof, they always like looking at the finer detail. Looking at this section here to show the highlights, pretty much the same. There's not much between these two files. All right, let's go have a look at the XT4 in relation to the XT2. XT2 left, XT4 right. Sorry, I'll get in there again. Okay, let's go in a nice and close up there. Again, look at the difference in the blue and the silver, blue in the image. Sharpness is very much the same. That wheel looks a little bit richer in its sort of brass gold color. It looks a little bit more whitewashed. Remember the same white balance settings. Those purple, this is even getting more intense now. As the ISO is going up, it seems as though the color is getting more intense. There's a big difference. The XT4 is way more natural to what the box actually was. Sharpening difference, pretty much the same, eh? You guys, maybe you're going to have to make up your mind on that one. It's hard to tell the difference there. See, what's throwing off it, what could appear, make something look sharper than the others, because the yellows behind the writing is different. So the yellow in the XT4 image is way more intense than the yellow in the XT2 image. Okay, so let's go again to the XT3, 3 on the left, XT4 on the right. Again, blues is the issue. The pinks are a little bit closer than what it is with the XT2, but XT4 is definitely rendering the scene way more naturally. And the yellows, again, it's the same differences going across the board. Sharpening from this distance is looking pretty good on the XT4. It's hard with the colors because the colors throw off the appearance of sharpening. Sharpening looks the same. Detail looks exactly the same. There are so little difference between these from an image quality perspective. Let's go have a look at the highlights. Maybe this is the difference here. This is at ISO 400. You can see a little bit more highlights there. That looks like it's more well balanced. Yeah, you can see the highlights here are definitely brighter. I'm starting to get the impression there might be more dynamic range in the XT4, ever so slightly. Look at the rims. They're not exactly the same tone or color, not tone, but color. But this highlight here is far more intense than the highlight there. Close, but I'm starting to think that there might be a little bit of an improvement on the dynamic range, or at least the way it controls its highlights. I think, or it's just a warmer white. I don't know. Don't know what it is. Next one. This is 800. Let's just turn that off. We're going to go to XT2 left, XT3 right. Again, from this distance, getting quite close. Still a little bit more intense on its colors, the XT2 to the XT3, ever so slightly. You can see that pink is definitely more vibrant than this. Yellows are kind of similar. I prefer the reds on the XT3. The reds on the XT2 are just, yeah, very, very vibrant. More, very, very intensive. I wonder if, what they'd learned from the XT2 is that it's nice to have the beautiful Fuji colors, but let's just ever so slightly tone them down a bit. Yeah, the reds are definitely more natural than the XT3. All right, so let's go out of that one. Let's go to now compare that to the XT. Okay, so XT3 left, XT4 right. Okay, again, looking at them, clearly a color difference in this. The yellows are way more intense than the XT4 again, and I think it more naturally handles the pink or the purple color. There's no doubt about it, and there's less blue in it. Sharpness, let's have a look. Are we going to start seeing a difference in noise performance? No, all look pretty much the same. Pretty much the same, not much difference there. Let's go look at those highlights again. Yeah, see that? See how the highlights are a little bit more brighter on the XT3 file. It just seems like the highlight areas are a bit more controlled in the XT4, ever so slightly, but from a noise perspective, they look pretty much the same, except for those color differences. Okay, and then just very briefly, I just wanted to check the XT2 against the XT4. Okay, so XT2 left, XT4 right. Okay, so I'm going to see those highlight differences. Okay, you can see the big color difference there. See that big color difference between the two? Massive color difference, especially in the reds and the yellow. The actual color of the silver is more blue. And look at the highlights. You see that? You see the XT2's highlights? See how much brighter they are? It must be a dynamic range difference there. the way it controls the highlights. There seems to be way more dynamic range in the XT4 image than there is the XT2 image. I mean, not that I would notice it from this distance. You wouldn't notice it at all from this distance. Like, you can't look at that and say, oh, that's got more dynamic range. But I wonder how that impacts the image when you're editing it. Like, what impact does it have in the greater scheme of things? That's the important question. And I can't answer that for you now because I'm not really doing a full-on edit with these. But this is 1600 ISO. Okay, image on the left, XT2, image on the right, XT3. All right, so yeah, so still a lot more similar between these two cameras than the XT4 when it comes to color, but I can still see a more intense color on the XT2 images. There's no doubt about it. The purples are different. Yellow is quite similar. The reds are a little bit more natural in the XT3. Slightly less blue in general. And a little bit better sort of handling of the highlights. There's no doubt about it. The XT3 is performing better with its highlights and controlling it than the XT2. But sharpness is pretty similar. Can't really tell the difference. Again, if you're zooming out on these images, yeah, you're hard pressed to tell. Like, if I showed you those images, you would not have a clue which camera they came from. I still prefer, if I'm going to choose between the color of the XT2 and the XT3, I'll go XT3 when it comes to colors, a little bit more natural. Okay, so XT2 on the left, XT4 on the right. Looking at the words underneath, pretty much the same. Again, the whites don't look the same color temperature. I don't know if that's just the white balance difference. There's definitely more blue in the left image than there is on the right image, which is the XT2 over the XT4. Pink's way different. Yellow's way different. Let's look at the highlights. Big difference in the highlights. The XT4 is handling the bright white areas with far more detail. Highlights in the wheels, you can see that highlight is a little bit more lost there, that highlight in comparison to this. There seems to be a bit more detail in it. So XT3 left, XT4 right, XT3 left, XT4 right. Okay, again, color difference there, far more natural. XT4 the same old. Sharpening is pretty much the same. I'm starting to see a fall off on all of the images with sharpening at 1600 that's not as sharp. It's not bad though, it's pretty good, but you can see that there's just a slight edge on the sharpening that's disappearing on all the images, on the wording as well. Definitely still handling the colors better, I think, XT4. And again, you can see that difference there, that highlight running through there is way more control than the XT4. So the XT4 is still maintaining some good dynamic range. And again, the highlights just look a little bit more controlled. And then obviously the color differences. But yeah, you can see a slight difference now with the sharpness and the higher ISOs. Okay, we are going to go to the next one, which is 3200 ISO. On the left is the XT2, the right is the XT3. Let's just have a look at it from this distance here. Yeah, again, closer in color, a little bit more natural in the reds. Sharpness is still maintaining very well for 3200 ISO. Just remember what I said though, I'm dealing with pretty good light coming in at a high ISO, and that does impact on the way we perceive noise, the way we see noise, and the way the camera produces noise with the signal to noise ratio. So just bear that in mind. Yeah, you can see now at 3200 it's just not as sharp everything as it was before. A little bit different. Again, the red's still more natural on the XT3. Okay, let's go XT3, XT4. Okay, so image on the left, XT3, image on the right, XT4. Again, there's the usual color differences we've discussed. More natural, the XT4. Let's see how the noise is handling now at 3200. Quite close actually, very close, very similar yellows. A big difference in those yellows and the reds. Wow, big difference. Look at that. Do you see that highlight mark there? It's almost gone here on the XT4. There's definitely an improvement in some sort of image. Looks a little bit flatter, like almost better control of highlights. I don't know if that's necessarily what you'd call dynamic range when it comes to actually pushing and pulling the image. That's not really what I'm talking about. It just seems to like control highlights better in the shot, in camera than the other two. Ever so slightly, not a lot, but ever so slightly. Okay, so now we're going into 6400. Interesting. This is XT2 on the left and XT3 on the right. Let's go back out again and look at the image. Very clean images. I mean, incredibly clean images. There's slight variations in color, very slight. It's weird. The XT3 looks like it's got more noise than the XT2. almost like you've applied noise reduction, and it kind of gets you that kind of, I don't know what the word to use for it, but you can see there, you can see that the actual noise is a little bit higher on the XT3 than it is on the XT2. Maybe this is down to pixel density in relation to the sensor size, that the XT3's actually got a little bit more noise, or there's something happening in camera that's processing that raw noise on the XT2. I don't know. Like the XT3's image looks sharper now at this high ISO. If you look at the 7 looks sharper than that. So less obvious noise, but decrease in sharpness. XT3 more obvious noise, but sharpness is maintained. Okay, so let's go compare the XT4 now with the XT2. Much sharper looking the XT4. Let's go have a look at it more closely. Again, the usual color differences are there. Generally a breakdown in sharpness across all images, but I'd say the XT2's sharpness is now starting to become noticeably less than the other two. There's more noise in the XT3 and the XT4 files at both 32 and 6400. More obvious at 6400. There's no doubt about it, you can see more noise, but it maintains a far higher level of sharpness. So this is now the XT3 on the left and the XT4 on the right. Let's have a look at this. They both look equally sharp. Again, those yellows look different on the XT4, and the pinks look more natural, and the reds look more natural, the usual. Sharpness-wise, they look pretty much the same. Noise-wise, they look the same. Dynamic range still looks better on the XT4. Slightly better control of highlights there. Slightly, there's just a little bit of something going on there. So go again to the XT2, XT4. This is the one that's got me all puzzled. Okay, again, I repeat, there seems to be more sharpening. There's no doubt about it. There's better resolution within the XT4 file, but there seems to be a high level of noise in the XT4 file. I think that must be to do with pixel density. So at this distance here, between the XT2 and the XT4, I'm starting to see at this distance that the image on the right looks a little bit sharper. There's more detail there. But from a noise perspective, I can't tell the difference at this distance. Only when I go in closer, then the noise becomes apparent on the XT4. Okay, so let's go look at the last one in the series. This is 1200. 1200 ISO, we've got XT2 left, XT3 on the right. There's more detail on the image, on the XT3 image than there is on the XT2 image. But there's more noise on the XT3 image than there is on the XT2 image. You see the noise here? You see the difference in noise? Because you can see the difference there. Look at that. It's less there. But there's no doubt about it. This image looks sharper than that image. That one's starting to look a little bit mushy. It's not bad for a 12,800 ISO image. It's incredible. Remember what I said about exposing correctly in camera as opposed to pushing light or pushing an image in low light. You can actually get really good results at high ISOs when you expose properly. You can actually get really good results. Okay, so from this distance here, there's no doubt that the XT3 image is sharper than the XT2 image. The detail looks more apparent, but I'm starting to see now that visibly there's more noise at this distance on the XT3 file. Well, let's actually look at XT2, XT4. It's pretty much the same as the XT3. It's a sharper image, but it's got way more noise in it. Yeah, it's got way more noise in it. But it handles the highlights better. XT3, XT4. These should be very close. Still more natural colors, still maintaining natural colors, the XT4 over the XT3. Sharpness is about the same. Reds still look better on the XT4. Noise is about the same. Wow, okay, so what have we learned? We've learned some interesting things. We've learned that the XT2 really handles its own against these two newer sensors and processors incredibly well. A couple of things that don't seem to render color the same way. With the same white balance set, they should be closer, but they're not. There's a difference in blues, there's a difference in yellows, and the way red is handled. And I think in effect, then affects the way purple is handled. The XT4, by no doubt, handles a color better in the sense, if you're looking for something that's going to accurately replicate what you see with your eye, to actually what you're photographing in real life, the XT4 to me looks less artificial, looks far more accurate. Still lovely colors, but it renders the colors way better than the other two cameras. Across the board, I'd say sharpness on the images is quite similar up to a certain point. 3200 and 6400 is no doubt about it. Both the XT3 and the XT4 are sharper than the XT2. The way at high ISOs, the way you see the outline of the writing and stuff like that, it looks sharper to me. But once we started getting into high ISO like 3200 or 6400, the XT2 started to perform better, which is crazy, than the other two. And as I said, I don't know if that's in-camera manipulation of the noise, because it kind of goes a little bit, because it's got that lack of sharpness, it kind of looks a little bit wormy. Not badly, not bad, very close, but I think it's got to do with the amount of pixels on that sensor. Because there's more pixels shoved into the same size, the noise is a little bit worse on the two newer cameras. And the other major thing that I've noticed, what I think could be quite major, it seems as though the XT4 outshone both others when it comes to dynamic range, meaning at those points in the image where there's highlights that are almost close to blowing out, I think that the XT4 handled those better. There's more detail in them, just ever so slightly. I'm talking about very fine detail. And I think the XT3 is a little bit stronger than the XT2. So from a dynamic range, I think we've seen a step up through each of those cameras, with the XT4 being the top performer there. So make of that what you will. It's, I think, quite interesting to see how well they do. The XT2 does well, man. Sure, it's a very good sensor considering how old it is now in relation to the other two sensors. So I don't know if you noticed this box behind me. Yep, this is a film scanner. I dug it out of my cupboard a couple of nights ago. It is, I think, about 17 years old, maybe 18 years old. I think I bought it in 2002, 2003, somewhere there. We're just on the cusp of changing from film cameras to digital cameras, and what most photographers were doing at that stage was shooting on film, digitizing the negative, and then working a little bit on it on Photoshop. The editing we did then was nothing like we do now, but yeah, that was my transition. So I actually did work with digital imagery before I actually shot on a digital camera. I've got a ton of negatives and slides of work that I shot, not wedding work, that I have never touched. It's quite a daunting process, and it's quite sad that I shot so much and I spent so much of my youth walking the streets, taking photographs, doing landscapes, and I can't even remember the stuff that I photographed. So exciting in a way that I get sort of get some time to be able to digitize them. So I'm going to turn that into a video in some way. I'm trying to decide how I'm going to do that. Thanks so much for your time. I hope that was helpful to you. I will be releasing another video. It will be my last video I'm doing on the XT4, because the XT4 is going back to Fujifilm, and I'll be focusing on tracking, and I'll also give my final thoughts on the camera. Please do visit my channel, and if you like what you see in general, please do subscribe. Much appreciated. God bless.